Hi, I'm Susan Glasser, staff writer for The New Yorker. I think it's wonderful that Diane has pivoted to podcasts because it allows her to go deeper and longer with an individual guest and to really sort of unpack more than you're able to do in a traditional radio segment. So I think it's a great format for an interviewer as skilled as Diane, and it gets us to still have a connection with her. I know that Diane loves having you as a listener, and if you feel so moved as to donate, it's easy to do. You just go to dianerehm.org/donate.
Hi, it's Diane. On my mind,
those who stormed this Capitol, and those who instigated and incited, and those who called on them to do so, held a dagger at the throat of America.
President Biden marked the anniversary of the violent insurrection at the Capitol with a warning. Attempts to undermine free and fair elections continue and threaten the foundation of our democracy. My guest, Norman Ornstein, has been preaching that same message. An emeritus scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, Ornstein was one of the first to identify a shift toward a politics of extremism in this country. He says Democrats must take to heart the lessons of January 6th and act quickly to shore up democratic institutions. I spoke to Ornstein Thursday morning about what he sees as the next steps toward accountability for the violence at the Capitol and how to secure the vote. Norm Ornstein, we spoke with you last year, immediately after the January 6th insurrection. And here we are, January 6th, 2022. I'd like to know your thoughts about contrasting where we were then and where we are now in regard to our democracy. And I know that's a big question, but it's one everyone wants to hear.
It's the critical question, Diane. And I have to say I am uneasy, I'm dismayed, I am really unsure about where we're going. I think we're at an existential moment. You know, in the aftermath of January 6th last year, where we almost literally dodged a bullet that was aimed at the heart of our constitutional system and our democracy. Time magazine named Elon Musk as their person of the year. The Capitol Police and the District of Columbia Police, who put their lives on the line and saved us, should have been the people of the year. But what's so dismaying is in the aftermath of this, first of all, on that day, the Capitol in shambles, parts of it just demolished, and the members got out, none of them killed. In that chamber, I've talked to a number of them, the realization that there was a mob of thugs that had come in. We had no idea if they had assault weapons, if any of them had entered the chamber, it could have mowed everybody down. And then they returned to the Capitol to do their constitutional duty, and 2/3 of House Republicans voted that the election of Joe Biden was illegitimate. And now here we are a year later, and 2/3 of self-identified Republicans nationally say that Donald Trump was the winner of that election. So was there any kind of learning curve? Was the country jolted enough by what happened in this unprecedented assault on our Constitution, on the Capitol itself, where people died? No is the answer. And if there's a learning curve, it's in the wrong direction, Diane, because what we've seen is, and remember, this wasn't just what happened on January 6th. It was what happened from November until January, culminating in January 6th, where there were efforts made in a number of states to overturn the legitimate results of the election, not just by Donald Trump, although obviously that smoking gun phone call that he had with Brad Raffensperger, can you find me just enough votes to win, was a major part of it. But you had state legislators, you had a whole series of other actors trying to negate the results of the election. What Trump was trying to do was to cut out 16 electoral votes that would have taken Joe Biden to 290, and Pennsylvania, where the legislature, a Republican legislature, would then have put up an alternative slate of delegates, and that would have taken him just to the exact number that he needed to win, and then they would have tried to get a rogue elector to throw the election to the House. This was a concerted effort to steal the election. When they say stop the steal, it was projection. They were trying to steal. And what we've seen is that in many of these states, they've tried to learn from how they failed to overturn the results of the election to make sure that they can succeed in 2024. Admiral Milley, or General Milley, made, I think, the appropriate analogy. There was a failed revolution in Russia in 1905. The communists learned the lesson and succeeded in 1917. And we are now at a point here on this anniversary where we had better learn that lesson in the other direction and put in some guardrails to protect them from doing this in 2024.
As you and I are speaking Thursday morning on the 6th of January, President Biden has just finished giving a speech from the Capitol, the House side. It was the strongest speech I've ever heard him make without using his name once. He called out the former president as one who could not accept loss, who carried a bruised ego, who was so absolutely fascinated with being powerful and wanted to stay in office no matter what. I've never heard him lay out and point the finger at Donald Trump in the way he did in this speech. Do you think the President of the United States making that speech directly to the millions of Americans who voted for him and those who did not can make a difference in their thinking when he talks about how close we came to losing our democracy that day?
Well, first, I'm heartened that Joe Biden has tried for a year to be a uniter. And in many ways, he continues to. We've had the pandemic sweep through Texas with a governor, Greg Abbott, who has done everything he can to undermine public health, blocking mask mandates, blocking vaccination mandates, trying to basically blow up the opportunities to deal with this deadly virus. And they've had, of course, this enormous surge in Texas because of Omicron. And Greg Abbott wants federal aid and wants the federal government to come in and bail him out. And Joe Biden's going to do that. And just as he's done with natural disasters that have hit states that didn't vote for him. That's a part of what you do as a president of the United States, and you try to unite. Obviously, mostly that attempt at unification has not worked because we still have Republicans who believe he's not a legitimate president, the majority of them. And we have 30% or so of them who believe that violence is an appropriate tactic if your way of life is threatened. So how do you deal with that? We're not going to deal with it clearly by just saying, let's all come together. And I saw that No Labels, this group that's been around for some time, said, we should be talking about unification and about warm things. We need to talk about the direct threats, and this is good that Joe Biden is taking this on directly. Our democracy is hanging by a thread. I'm not exaggerating here. This is not for effect. And we need the President of the United States to reflect that urgency, which I think he will do as well in this next week, to move the Senate to act on these bills that are not perfectly going to prevent us from heading into the abyss, the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Restoration Act, but that are absolutely necessary to make sure that our elections are run the way we want our elections run, which is voters can vote and those votes will be counted and the fair results will be reflected. Now, I do think that we have at least some part of our population, independents, some Republicans, who are open to facts and data. And the facts on this are clear. You don't have to mention Donald Trump's name to realize that he instigated this riot, that he sat watching television while it occurred and did nothing to try and stop it, that he had a plan, and we know that there were many others, almost certainly including some members of Congress, who laid out for the rioters the unmarked offices of leaders so that they could be intimidated or maybe even killed. We know that there was a plan in place to try and disrupt the counting of the electoral votes. We need to have that clear to people, and if 40% of Americans simply won't listen to it, will say, talk to the hand, and are getting their information from Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson and Fox and talk radio and social media, helped by Facebook and others who are not doing nearly enough to block this. We've got to focus on the 60%, or maybe even we'll get to 70% of Americans who realize the gravity of the situation. The president's the key actor in this.
To what extent do you think the work of the January 6th Commission will be aided by the strength of President Biden's speech today?
I think that will make a difference. I do want to say, Diane, it's the January 6th committee because when we had an opportunity to create a bipartisan commission, which was put together by a Republican, John Katko, in the House, designated by the Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, to work out a balanced deal that gave them the opportunity to block subpoenas, to have their own witnesses and the like. It was filibustered by Mitch McConnell and senators because they didn't want an investigation into January 6th. Now we have a committee that's moving forward commendably, and thank goodness we have people like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger who put the priority of our democracy and our system ahead of their own identity as Republicans. They are doing a terrific job. I had a piece in USA Today yesterday with a former prosecutor, Dennis Aftergut, pointing out how they don't really need the testimony of some of these highly public figures who are now under criminal contempt charges because they're getting a whole lot of others who were in the room as this thing happened. And now there's an added impetus, and I think what President Biden's speech is going to do, it's going to get an attention focused on this so that when this January 6th committee moves to public hearings, there will be another opportunity for people to see the horrors of what happened. You know, one of the problems here, Diane, is that we saw this set of videos at the impeachment trial. They were horrific. We have seen it in this HBO documentary that is just harrowing as you watch what happened. But it's the nature of news and of human nature that you focus on this for a minute and then it goes away and other things take over. And of course, the pandemic, our daily lives under challenge, makes that happen. You have to be reminded continuously of the horrors of what occurred on January 6th, of the disastrous attempts to destroy our democracy that led up to it. And I'm hoping as well that the speech that Merrick Garland gave yesterday to the Justice Department will result in moving forward and holding accountable all the people involved with this. And not just on January 6th, but in November and December as well.
A quick break. When we come back, More of my conversation with Norman Ornstein. And we're back. Here's the rest of my conversation with Norman Ornstein, Emeritus Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. His most recent book is titled One Nation After Trump. Norm, can you give me an example of some of the new evidence that's emerging in regard to the January 6th insurrection and the people who are coming forth with that evidence?
So what we know, first of all, and let's go back to something that we knew before, where Jamie Herrera Butler, a Republican in the House, testified that Kevin McCarthy had been on the phone as the House chamber was under siege with Donald Trump, begging him to turn this off. And Trump basically first said it was Antifa, and McCarthy said, that's wrong, it's your people. And then Trump said, I guess they just care more about the election than you do, Kevin. So we have direct evidence that he knew what was going on and refused to do anything about it. Now we know from people who were in the room with him in the White House, from people who worked for the administration and worked directly for the president, that among other things, his daughter Ivanka went into the Oval Office twice and asked him to turn this off. We know that Sean Hannity, who was his de facto chief of staff, and in communication with him, with Mark Meadows, his real chief of staff, official chief of staff, in advance of this was saying, you've got to stop this from taking place. And as it was going on, turn this off. He can't talk about the election anymore. We know from a whole series of tweets that we have, of email exchanges and text exchanges from people with the president or people close to him, that he was directly involved in instigating this. And we know that while it was happening, when it was clear that the Capitol was being trashed and that people's lives were at stake, including his own vice president, he encouraged it and didn't do a thing to try and stop it.
What about the testimony of retired Lieutenant Colonel Keith Kellogg? What did we learn from him?
We learned as well that not only was the president directly involved in this, but we also know that in the Defense Department, we had put in place cronies of the president as top officials in the Defense Department were removed right after the election, before any of this took place, who very deliberately blocked the National Guard from providing reinforcements from coming to the Capitol, so that the Capitol Police and the District of Columbia Metropolitan Police who were there would be vastly outmanned in what happened. And we know as well that there were some at the FBI who knew that there's violence was planned, who didn't move this up the chain or do anything about it. You know, we of course look at some of these major figures who are refusing to testify and either pleading Fifth Amendment or saying that they're simply not going to come in. Their testimony would be significant, although frankly, any of them who actually did come in, including Mark Meadows, who has turned over a lot of information, would simply either plead executive privilege or plead the Fifth Amendment. So it's not likely we're going to get anything more out of them. But it's people like Keith Kellogg, people like the former press secretaries and First Lady's chief of staff and others who were around, lower level figures in the White House appalled by what was happening, who are going to give us the more devastating information. And what we also know from all of those texts and other things that Meadows has turned over, heaven knows what's in the things that he won't turn over, a lot of additional information. Now, you know, we're not going to be able to get some of those things directly from former President Trump, although some of it will come from him. And he has no executive privilege as a former president, at least.
Even though he claims it.
He claims it, but we've already seen judges who have given the deference to the current president in terms of what can be released. But when it comes to people like Sean Hannity, who is trying to say that he's a journalist, although in the past he has said directly, "I'm not a journalist, I'm a talk show host," who is acting not in his capacity as a news person, but as a friend and political advisor to the president, who can't claim any privilege, that we're going to get a lot of information. And I'm hopeful, by the way, Diane, so much of this is on Donald Trump. But when I look at people like Paul Gosar, Louis Gohmert, and the other members of Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who led tours of the Capitol the day before, where we know that they had maps of where to go, and they would have gotten that only with the assistance of members of Congress, that we're going to get more information. And the tricky part for the January 6th committee is going to be able to get members of Congress subpoenaed to come in and testify. The idea that this is part of their official business is, of course, nonsensical.
Do you think that could, in fact, happen? In other words, is there going to be accountability for this insurrection? And if so, what form do you see it taking?
So I think what could happen to the members of Congress who very likely were a part of this plot leading up to January 6th, if they don't turn over their phone records, and some of those phone records are already in process, the people that they were conspiring with outside, some of whom have said that they were talking to these members of Congress, are going to have to turn over their phone records, their texts. We're going to learn a lot. The dismaying thing to me is we already know enough that some of these members should have been expelled or at minimum censured, which is the next closest thing in a penalty where you're on the floor of the House and you are condemned by your colleagues. But Republicans have refused to take any accountability for what happened. I believe Liz Cheney when she says that maybe 100 of her colleagues have privately said to her or have made it clear that they believe she's right, but they just simply can't take on the burden of what she did. The lack of moral courage here, the willingness to go along, has made it abundantly clear to me that we no longer have a Republican Party. We have a cult, and the fear of being shunned or excommunicated, of facing threats yourself, as she and Kinzinger have had, of losing in primaries.
Kinzinger has already said he will not run again because he knows he would be defeated. Let's move on here to questions that involve voting rights and the lengths to which Republicans have gone to ensure that a large portion of the population will have its voting rights impeded, delayed, discounted, or even invalidated. I mean, what can we do about that if, as is predicted, the Republicans take back the House and Senate in November?
Well, first, it is absolutely urgent, I believe, to get enacted the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The John Lewis Act basically tries to restore those elements of the Voting Rights Act that were shockingly and inappropriately, I believe, eviscerated by the Supreme Court. And not just in the Shelby County decision, which knocked out Section 5, the pre-clearance part of the Voting Rights Act, but this most recent Brnovich decision, which really shredded Section 2, the most significant remaining element. Now, that's mostly involving attempts to invalidate the votes or suppress the votes of African Americans and other people of color. The attempts here to suppress votes and overturn votes are broader than that. The Freedom to Vote Act, which was a compromise put together by a group that included Joe Manchin, that was a version of the previous For the People Act, but, with some of the elements taken out so that Manchin could try to get 10 Republicans in the Senate to go along so that they wouldn't have it filibustered. Didn't get a single one. And now it's a question of whether the rules change to make these laws work. Now, there's a caveat here. Congress has the clear, explicit constitutional authority to regulate federal elections, not state elections, not the elections for governors, for state houses and senates. But it's federal elections that are critical at this point. And what this law does is to put some limits on the ability of states like Georgia or Arizona or Iowa that enable partisans to fire or sideline election officials who do their jobs. And some of the heroes in the last election were Republican election officials who wouldn't let the legitimate results be overturned. They're trying to make sure that won't happen again. We need that protection. At the same time, the ability to suppress votes by taking away polling places, by making it harder for people to be able to cast absentee ballots or votes by mail, by eliminating voting on Sundays when an awful lot of people of color go to vote, by having onerous requirements like voter IDs that are difficult for some people to obtain. This bill, the Freedom to Vote Act, would make it more difficult for that to happen and would also make it more difficult for partisan bodies to basically take an election result and say, no, we don't like that, we're going to overturn it. It's not perfect. And the fact is, because state legislatures have authority to send the electors, the slates of electors to the Capitol to be counted, we still have a big danger. But if we don't get these bills, we don't have a chance of keeping them from basically distorting the 2022 elections to take the majority in the House or the 2024 elections and the presidency. And remember, if they take the majority in the House, we have a number of prominent figures who said, why don't we make Donald Trump Speaker of the House? And this is not just sort of a crazy idea or a fanciful thing. It's crazy, but it could happen. The Speaker doesn't have to be a member of the House. I've had journalists say to me, oh, he would never do that because you have to work as Speaker. Why would Donald Trump think that he would have to work? He would have a sinecure, a place where he could spout his lies, a staff, and maybe some protection against legal action that could be taken against him at the state or federal level. And if it's not him, my guess is a Republican Speaker would be a Jim Jordan. We would have endless investigations. We would have no ability to do anything to solve the problems in the country. We would be in a farcical situation. And, voters may decide that that's the House that they want, but we don't want to give them that extra heavy thumb on the scales that comes when they distort the elections.
Well, when it comes to voting, where is Joe Manchin now in regard to the filibuster?
So it's up in the air, Diane, and it's Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. And Manchin is the heir to Robert Byrd and believes that, he has to follow in Byrd's tradition. He has to be convinced that Robert Byrd would be appalled at what he sees now and that Byrd himself changed the rules numerous times because of actions taken by his own colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, that tried to undermine the ability to move to a vote, even if the filibuster were in place. Sinema believes that this is the way to get debate and deliberation and bipartisan compromise. The reality, which many of his colleagues and I have tried to impress upon both he and Sinema in different venues, is we don't have debate now. because the burden's entirely on the majority. And the minority doesn't have to do a thing but call in and say, one of them, I'm going to filibuster. We don't get debate. You know, one of the examples I often use, the House passed last year 2 bills for universal background checks on guns. They will never come up for a vote or debate in the Senate because they'll be filibustered. So the public isn't going to have a chance to hear people try to defend the indefensible, something 94% of Americans believe in, background checks on guns, and that would be a burden on them. We don't get debates now. If we have anything done in a bipartisan fashion, it's not because the filibuster forces it. It's because Republicans in the Senate see it in their own self-interest, as they did with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which they got engaged in sizable part because they wanted to head off the Build Back Better bill. If we had a change in the filibuster rule, and the one that I and Al Franken have pushed for 10 years now, is to shift the burden to the minority. Move it from 60 required to end debate to 41 required to continue debate. If you put a burden on them, they're going to have to be there on the weekends. They're going to have to be there on Mondays and Fridays and not back home raising money or campaigning. They're going to have to sleep on lumpy cots off the Senate floor because if they're not there on the floor, you can move to a vote. They're going to come to the Democrats and say, you know what, maybe we should work something out here to avoid that. So it's a matter of convincing them that we want to restore the filibuster to something where, as it was for most of the time it was in place, the burden was on the minority. We're not going to get rid of the filibuster now. And one of the other little twists here that some Democrats in the Senate have been talking about is we'll do it once a year. So it's only going to be done on one significant issue or set of issues. So you don't have to worry about a slippery slope where it'll all lead to the end of the filibuster, which they simply don't want. Right now, it's a matter of triage and getting to that point. We're close, but we're not over the finish line, and it's got to happen soon.
So we started this conversation by talking about President Biden's speech. Let's end by talking about what he must do in the next few weeks and months to get this country back on sound footing.
So we have, I think, 2 major challenges here. One is, which we haven't really talked about, the pandemic, which is, I think, a major cause of the distemper in the country, even as the economy in most respects is just booming. 800,000 jobs created in the last month. All the different indicators of the economy except inflation just moving in a positive direction that we haven't seen in decades. But people are not happy. And I think a major reason they're not happy is we've had 2 years of disruption in their lives, schools closed, jobs in question. And when we thought it was over or at least ending, it came right back, roaring back. We've got to get this under control. And then we'll have an opportunity maybe for a dialogue or to get people feeling better about where we are. Now, beyond that, there's only so much a president can do to convince senators to change their opinions. That's something that senators have to do. But a president can weigh in as he has. His role now is the public role. Today's speech should be the first of many that he gives, where he makes it clear to people, something that most Americans don't read about or focus on much, that we have a direct threat to something that we have taken for granted for 250 years, other than the period around the Civil War. This is a bigger threat to our fundamental democracy and the process of fair elections and the legitimate transfer of power than we have seen since the Civil War. And it has to be made clear to people. Frankly, our media have fallen far short here. Margaret Sullivan, the columnist in the Washington Post, who has done the most powerful stuff, did a piece earlier this week saying that we have to take the urgency of the threat to democracy as seriously as the threat of climate or other things. It has to be a front page story. It has to be a core element of everything that's done, and it can't be done in a both sides way. It can't be done by saying Democrats believe there's a threat to democracy, Republicans believe that it's all about voter fraud. It's not about voter fraud. It's about a threat to democracy. And the president can help to make that happen as well. He has to make this priority number one right now. Remember that in less than 2 weeks, we will have the Martin Luther King holiday. Martin Luther King also understood that the economic situation and the well-being of people and the right to vote are intertwined. He focused on both. The president has to take the Martin Luther King holiday as a springboard to talking about the preciousness of the vote, that are, often people say it's a republic, not a democracy. In a republic, people vote for their representatives who then represent them. If you don't have the ability to vote, you don't have a legitimate republic. And if you don't elect representatives who then represent you, and the partisan gerrymandering has made that even more of a challenge, also addressed in the Freedom to Vote Act, then you're not voting for representatives who will represent you. They will represent a sliver of those voters who are out there. So the president, I think, needs to use that as the next occasion after January 6th to give a major national speech and then to give a bunch of speeches around it, using that bully pulpit to frame this the way it needs to be framed. This is as critical as anything I have seen in my lifetime. If we lose this battle now, we may not be able to fight the war again for a very, very long period of time. Once it's gone, it doesn't come back very easily. Remember, just as we end, just the other day, Donald Trump gave his full-throated, complete endorsement to Viktor Orban, the authoritarian, kleptocratic leader in Hungary. This is Donald Trump's role model, along with Vladimir Putin, Sisi in Egypt, Duterte in the Philippines. I don't want America to become the next Hungary, much less the next Russia. I want America to be the beacon of freedom and democracy for the world that we were and are no longer. And the president has to take up that banner and carry it forward. And the rest of us has to do whatever we can as well.
Norman Ornstein, as always, thank you.
As always, thank you, Diane.
That was Norman Ornstein, Emeritus Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and contributing writer at The Atlantic. And that's all for today. We welcome your feedback and suggestions. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter or send us an email, drpodcast@wamu.org. Our theme music is composed by Jim Brunberg and Ben Landsberg of Wonderly. The show is produced by Allison Brody. Our engineer today is Adrian Danhauser. Thanks for listening all. Please stay safe, be well. I'm Diane Rehm.